What's up, everybody? It's George back again with Warp Charge Gaming. Excited to be here to give you a overview video on what it's like to go through a combat sequence in Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. So in this video, you'll see me go through an expedition and then return back to the Precipice, and I'll give you a general idea of how that is done. So I hope you enjoy the video. Let's get to the action. So here's where we see the game in action. Once the explorers have gotten into their transport and gone into the Blackstone Fortress, you draw from the exploration deck on the left side inside the Precipice cutout. Upon entering the Blackstone Fortress and drawing from the exploration deck, you'll get either a combat card or a challenge card. In this case, you see a combat card that dictates the layout of the chambers to create the battlefield, as well as the location of the discovery markers where the encounters will be deployed from. In the top right, you can see the combat bar, where we have laid out on the top of the bar the encounters that we will be up against, the locations of the discovery markers they will deploy from, and the initiative order of our explorers with the hostiles. The discovery markers are labeled 1 through 4, and each combat zone will dictate how many different discovery markers will be implied. Each discovery marker will have a paired hostile that will be tied to it. The hostiles will be inside the encounter deck. The encounter deck gets more and more difficult hostiles added to it as you progress through the quest. So you're seeing the board set up after the battlefield creation step that we did from pulling the combat exploration card. We deployed the hostiles to their relative discovery markers, and we've set up the initiative deck to have the numbered hostiles as well as the explorers that we are using. You play with 4 explorers. If you play by yourself, then you're going to use all 4. If you play with 2 people, then you split them in half. If you play with 3, then the 4th hero will be in control by whoever is the leader for any given round. And if you play with 4, then you divide it evenly. If you play with 5, then the 5th person will control the hostile models. Now, once we have the battlefield set up and the hostiles deployed and the initiative deck created, then the combat turn sequence begins. The first thing to do in the combat turn sequence is the destiny phase. We roll 5 dice over by the Precipice that are the destiny dice. You can see a green and a red arrow there. You discard any doubles that occur into the red arrow, and any unique numbers that did not double or triple become the destiny dice that you're able to use for that round. Once the destiny dice are made, then it goes to the activation rolls for each of the individual explorers, and they will have as many activations as they have empty slots for on their cards. In this case, for instance, the robot only has 3. As you collect wounds, it takes away activation dice. So the more wounded you become, the less you can activate a particular explorer. On the combat bar, we've randomly deployed the initiative of each of the explorers and hostiles. Then you take a step in the initiative phase called cover fire, where any of your explorers that can see one another can swap their initiative on the combat bar. Once you've gone through the cover fire step, then you can perform gambits. And for the spinning and activation dice, you're able to attempt an agility roll to switch places to the left or the right of the nearest hostile on the combat bar. If you get a critical success, you can switch with any of the hostiles. And if you get just a success, you can switch to the nearest one, left or right. In this step, this is where you're going to attempt to be able to get your heroes in generally fighting first before the combatants, or last if you need them to come closer. In this step, you're unable to use destiny dice to do a gambit of switching places in the initiative. So you can only use the activation dice that are for each explorer to do so. Once the initiative phase is done and all the gambits have been complete in the cover fire to determine the order of the initiative on the combat bar, then the combat really begins. So now it's time for the activation phase. This is where we're going to use the activation dice that each explorer has been able to accumulate. When we roll the activation dice on standard D6s, the numerical value that is rolled are used to pay a cost that is required for each different type of activation you can make. An explorer has special ability activations it can do that have a particular cost tied to it. They have attacks that they can make, of course, with different weapon types. Different weapons and the way that they use them can either be a simple cost of 1, so just needing a 1 on the activation dice, or sometimes as much to 4 to 6, requiring a 4 to 6 on the roll of the activation dice determined in the initiative phase. So you have to choose the actions that you wish to do based on the cost that you're able to pay with the dice roll on the activation dice. This is where you can also choose to be able to use the destiny dice that you rolled to accomplish the things you need per your different explorers. Each explorer can only use 2 destiny dice in this way, and you're able to do the same type of action as many times as you want. When you get to an explorer on the combat bar, when it's their turn's initiative, you can go through all the activations you have activation and destiny dice for. Any dice that you choose not to use on the explorer will then be saved to do an overwatch reaction to respond to the movements of enemy models. Whenever you leave dice in this way, any unspent dice rolls of a 1 are simply discarded, and all other dice results are reduced by 1. So a 6 becomes a 5 becomes a 4, etc. These will be the totals that you have when attempting to make your Overwatch reactions. Overwatch is basically shots that you can make after an enemy model has moved or attacked or things of that nature. So you continue down the combat bar, activating explorers and hostiles at their initiative step. Whenever you activate a hostile, it's a bit different than an explorer in the sense that their activations are determined by the roll of the Blackstone dice, or the D20. On the back of each of the hostile data cards, it has a D20 chart that references in what type of situation they're in, whether they're in a close encounter, totally hidden from line of sight, hiding behind cover, whatever type of way that they match the card. You then roll the D20, and based on where you land will dictate how they operate. On the back of the soft-covered book of combat, it tells you a quick reference chart of all the different references that you could roll on the D20 chart and how the enemies will behave. Whenever it gets to a hostile's initiative, then all the hostiles of that type, all the drones or all the cultists or all the Chaos Space Marines, they all will go through their D20 activation. So you'll roll for each model and go through the steps of how it reacts. After this, any one of these actions from any particular hostile, then the explorers are able to overwatch if they have remaining activation dice, but only once per explorer per triggered model. Of course, the triggered overwatch must go against the model that triggered it in the first place. So as you go through the combat and lay down attacks on the hostiles and vice versa, on each data card it shows the hostiles' wound count. Whenever you've reduced them to 0 wounds, then you're going to remove them from the board. In combat, whenever you're making characteristic checks, you're doing these on the custom dice system that is used between a D8, D10, and D6. Provided by the inside the box. On each of the dice you have failure, which is a blank side, a success, which is a single symbol, and a critical success, which is when you have double of the symbol. When dishing out wounds, you are causing regular wounds and as well as grievous wounds. This really comes into play whenever you do a grievous wound to an enemy model. It is worth 3 wounds versus a regular one being worth just 1. Whenever a grievous wound is done to a explorer, it's a bit more difficult of a wound to deal with than a standard one, as it is not able to be healed with a recuperate action in the activation phase. It can only be removed at the end of combat, and if you're lucky enough in the recovery step to succeed on your vitality roll. Whenever an explorer is taken out of action, at the end of the combat, if the explorers are able to escape from that portion of the Blackstone Fortress, then there's a recovery step where you get to roll to see if your explorer can survive. You basically roll the Blackstone dice or the D20 dice, and if you're equal to or less than the amount of grievous wounds that you have, then you die. If you're within sight of a expedition and you're in the recovery step and an explorer is killed, then that particular expedition has ended and you must return back to the Precipice to get another explorer to join the quest. When there's no longer 4 explorers to make an expedition into the Black Fortress, then the quest is lost and you must begin anew. So in summary, combat goes like this. You start off by doing the destiny dice, then you go into the initiative phase and get your activation dice rolls for each of your individual explorers. You lay out the initiative cards randomly showing the order of the hostiles and the explorers. You then are able to manipulate that order using the cover fire step and as well as gambits, where you attempt to use your agility to switch places in the initiative step. Finally, then each hostile and explorer goes through an activation phase where the explorers spend their activation dice and destiny dice to accomplish a number of different abilities and tasks, while the hostiles will roll on a D20 activation chart to dictate how each of them react as it comes to their turn. Any dice not spent count towards Overwatch, which can be a reaction triggered by the hostile movements and actions. After you've gone through all of the combat in a round, you will see if any inspiration is gained by explorers, and you do that by rolling a d20 and attempting to roll the number of wounds or less that was dealt to models killed by a particular explorer. So if an explorer killed 2 cultists that had 2 wounds apiece, then that would be a total of 4 wounds that it would be trying to roll 4 or less on the d20. If done, then you would gain a inspiration counter, which can be used in the game to do things like re-rolling, becoming inspired, exploring markers that you're not directly on top of, and being able to make adjustments in the initiative step, the gambits, without paying the cost of an activation dice. So inspiration tokens are useful, but require a good amount of kills and a lucky d20 roll to gain some. Combat is complete when you are able to get all of the explorers into the escape pod and leave the portion of Blackstone Fortress. When you first arrive to the board, there's typically about 3 portals that are on the edges of the board, and those portals are where you can summon the escape pod. At the end of each combat round, you roll on an event table. That event table has a variety of good and negative effects that it can take place for the next round of combat. And sometimes the escape chamber will appear at a portal at the farthest range of the explorers. Otherwise, the explorers must summon the escape chamber by getting to the portals in order to make the summon. So as I go through several rounds of combat, repeating the steps of the initiative phase, the activation phase, the event phase, finally the explorers make it to the escape chamber, and instead of going into the next combat turn sequence, they choose to leave that area of the Blackstone Fortress, where then you then move into the recovery step and can attempt to heal your wounds, and then into the leader step, where you're able to exchange any cards amongst the explorers and be able to pass the leader chip on to the next player. Continue to draw explorer cards and face challenges or additional combats inside of a single expedition. You continue down this path collecting clues and making discoveries of resources and Archeotech that you can then trade later at the Precipice for even further advancements into your explorers. Your whole goal here through the expeditions is to collect enough clues to be able to find the location of one of the strongholds inside the Blackstone Fortress. It requires 4 clues to be turned in to be able to go on an expedition to a stronghold instead of just into the Blackstone itself. You must defeat 4 of the strongholds and collect their stronghold artifacts in order to advance to the final portion of the quest that seeks the hidden vault. So there's quite the grind to be had to go through these motions. You will find yourself quite damaged up after a couple of rounds of combat. The strongholds look like a massive undertaking, and the quest alone to achieve enough resources to be able to take on the strongholds, let alone survive them and make it to the end of the quest, is no easy feat. They have it stacked pretty hard, and it's definitely going to take some thoughtful play and long run maneuvering to be able to survive all the way to the end, I believe. They do also have a way to play one-off games, and they have also designed it to be very well to pick up and return back to and have players intermix and jump into battles. They give you all your stylized zip blocks to be able to take your tokens and additional artifacts you've gathered and just zip them up with each of the individual characters and explorers, so that you can always just be able to jump right back into where you left off with your same pieces where they need to be. Now, in a one-off game version, there's a normal, hard, and extreme mode, and it's just about how many clues and archeotechs can you collect inside of a single expedition without returning to the Precipice. So that's pretty cool. Learning the game, I did play basically on my own to figure it out, and I found that it was quite easy to go through and experience the game. Once you have chosen to return to the Precipice, that is when you go through the legacy and trading step. Your ships that are where your explorers hail from are docked at the Precipice. There, when you're inside of the Blackstone Fortress, they have support abilities that you can draw from while inside of the Blackstone. When you return back to the Precipice, you flip them over to their facilities side, and here the explorers can take their choice of visiting one of the 4 ships and using the facilities if they like, as well as making trade. The Archeotechs that you collect through the discovery that you make inside Blackstone can be traded in for trade points that you use to trade with the ships for their resources. Each ship has its own deck of cards that you draw 3 from when you go into the Precipice, and those 3 are what you can attempt to trade for with your trade points made from Archeotech. If you were to be trading with a ship that is where you hail from, you get an additional trade point for free going for those pieces of tech. Sometimes you'll go to a ship based on the facilities it has and then opt to trade with what's left there. Before you trade, though, first you draw a legacy card. This is known as the legacy step. There are 12 total legacy cards to be drawn. When there is no longer a legacy card to be drawn, then the game is over and you've lost. So by the 13th expedition, you need to be seeking the hidden vault, or else there will be no further legacy cards to draw when you return to the Precipice, and the game will be lost. Well, my friends, this is a general overlook of how the gameplay looks. I hope you enjoyed this brief overview by myself as I learned the game. I would love to hear from you on what your thoughts are on the Blackstone Fortress Warhammer Quest game are. Let's have a conversation about how things go along the way. So I appreciate y'all. Keep taking fun seriously. Cheers.